Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My next topic is rules of interpretation. This is rather a technical subject. We are looking mainly at the words of the text of the Quran and Sunnah, and they are both, of course, in Arabic. I am rather reluctant to make this too technical. I'll try to avoid it, but all of it cannot be avoided. To extract the rules of new issues from the text of the Quran and Sunnah necessitates for the scholar and mujtahid a firm grasp of the words in the text of the Quran, or any text for that matter, which is why that the subject rules of interpretation has been included under the rubric of usul al-fiqh or jurisprudence. Otherwise, a great deal of it might fall actually under the study of languages, but it is as a tool for ijtihad. It is essential. Often the beginning of ijtihad starts from understanding of the text. When the text is explicit and clear and deliver its meaning, then there is no need for interpretation. But most of the textual data of the Quran and Sunnah are in need of interpretation. And the meaning of command or prohibition, and sometimes words or text, one text may be in conflict with another. It is essential that we understand them and place them in their proper place. The purpose of this discussion obviously is not to read the text for its own sake, but to discover the meaning and the intention of the lawgiver from the reading of the text. The words are classified in different ways depending on the purpose of classification. We look at the classification of words from the viewpoint of clarity or the opposite of it, from the viewpoint of the scope of their application, and from the viewpoint of how people understand them. This is, but before we enter this linguistic discussion, there are two expressions in Islamic jurisprudence that we need to look at first. One is tafsir. Tafsir, that is textual interpretation, and the other is ta'wil, that is allegorical interpretation. The first one is closely confined to the meaning of the words of the text, whereas in the second allegorical interpretation we go beyond the words of the text, and sometimes a speculative component may be looked at, and it becomes a part of what we call ijtihad and research, which is not always definitive. This effort, allegorical interpretation, may require specifying the general in the text, or sometimes qualifying the absolute text. And basically, normally, all words and whatever text, the Quran and Sunnah or a legal text, normally they carry their unrestricted meaning, general meaning, absolute meaning, unless, of course, there is a reason for us to qualify the absolute or to specify the general. In the context of Sharia, both tafsir and ta'wil are meant to clarify the legal text and to discover the intention of the lawgiver. Whenever the necessary interpretation is provided for a text, especially if the text of the Quran is interpreted by the Sunnah, then that becomes an integral part of the meaning of the text. But allegorical interpretation is not integral to the reading of the text. Sometimes the two, tafsir and ta'wil, may concur and correspond over the same meaning. But we are actually in jurisprudence concerned mainly not with the first tafsir, but rather with ta'wil, that is, to provide a meaning to a word that is not always self-evident. So what is the definition of ta'wil? It is departure from the manifest meaning of a word to another meaning because of a certain evidence that exists to justify that departure. In order to resort to ta'wil, we need to have certain conditions. One is that there should be some reason for us to attempt it. Otherwise, there is no need to depart from the obvious words of the text. And the scope of ta'wil also is limited to those parts of the text which are not quite self-evident. So the general and the absolute and the manifest, they can take ta'wil in interpretation, but not the mufassar and the muhkam, that which has been self-explained and that which is absolutely clear. Similarly, the specific as opposed to general, the khas as opposed to am, in the qualified, the scope of ta'wil to these more specific and clearer parts of the text is rather limited. But the second condition is, this was the second, that the scope of ta'wil is limited and we should be aware of that limitation. And the third, that interpretation that we offer is not far-fetched. And four, that the person who exercises it is qualified. So there are four conditions before ta'wil is attempted. These should be in place. There are some parts of the Quran that words that are used maybe in the nature of a homonym that has more than one meaning, and it requires recourse to ta'wil to find out which one would be the most appropriate. To give an example of rather a far-fetched interpretation, there is a hadith. One person, Firuz al-Dailami, came to the Prophet. He had two wives and intended to divorce one, and the Prophet announced this: to retain whichever you wish and separate from the other. Now the Hanafis have interpreted this, that if these two were married in separate contracts, the one who was married first, that should be released, and the later should be retained, because the text used وَفَارِقِ الْأُخْرَى. But this is rather remote. Inject this kind of meaning, which contract was first, which contract, and that would be rather remote. We must look whether there is some indication that the Prophet intended that kind of interpretation. And the other element is whether there should be a new marriage with the person that is retained. And that also the Hanafi interpretation has something to say and takes us rather further beyond the meaning of the text. An example of a proper application of ta'wil is the text in Surah 5 verse 6, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ. Literally the word qumtum, when you stand up for prayer, then make an ablution. But the intended meaning of standing up is when you intend to perform prayer, then you make a wudu, not when you actually stand to start. And after that would be the proper application of ta'wil. We do not encourage recourse to ta'wil, rather liberally, but to abandon ta'wil completely is likely to lead to rigidity, and we must have this facility available. Now the words of the text from the viewpoint of clarity or ambiguity. The words of the text are classified into two. One is wadih, the other ghair wadih, clear and ambiguous. The clear words are those that deliver this meaning without recourse to any interpretation or ta'wil. Whereas the ambiguous words, they necessitate some kind of interpretation. Now the clear words are divided into four types. This is the manifest, zahir, the nas, explicit, mufassar, explained, and muhkam, perspicuous. 4 degrees of clarity. We will be giving examples of this and explain a little. And also the ambiguous words are divided into 4 types. The khafi, obscure, mushkil, difficult, mujmal, ambivalent, mutashabi, completely unclear. Now the first 2, nas and zahir, that is manifest and explicit, both of these words, zahir and nas, have meaning which is clear. But in the case of manifest or zahir, the meaning is not in harmony with the context in which it occurs. Whereas in the case of nas, the meaning is clear and also it is in harmony with the context in which it occurs. The clear text and the nature of nas or zahir, both of them are open to ta'wil. And they are, only the first is open to abrogation. There are examples that I have given in my chapter, and some discussion is also found of these words in Abdullah Saeed's book, The Quran, an introduction. I would not engage in giving too many examples in specific details, but to give an example of a nas, the hadith which say that zakat is in every 40 sheep, 1 should be given in zakat. Now it is fairly clear, 40 in 1 in zakat. But sometimes even a clear text like this requires some interpretation, and that is whether the monetary value of that is also acceptable or not. The zahir, which is manifest, it occurs in a text, but it is not in harmony with the main context. And I've given example of the verse on gambling and wine drinking, that 590, Surah 4, verse 90, that liquor drinking and gambling are the work of the devil, abandon it. Now this, abandon these substances, this is the principal message and theme, and everything is consistent here. But in another 2 verses later we say that لَيْسَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ جُنَاحٌ فِي مَا طَعِمُوا إِذَا مَا اتَّقَوْا. Those who are faithful and do good deeds, there is no blame on them whatever they eat, so long as they are upright. Now whatever they eat, so long as they are upright, as if this overrules the previous text on wine drinking. No, this is not the main theme. The main theme is to explain the virtue of piety. So our next classification, we move to mufassar, that is self-explained, in muhkam, perspicuous. This is a higher degree of clarity after the zahir in the nas. Now a text is self-explained. When that happens, there is no need for recourse to interpretation of either kind, whether tafsir or ta'wil. And the explanation that is provided is either given in the same text or in another text. The same text, for example, there is a punishment of 100 lashes for adultery. In the text here clarifies the type of the offense and the number of lashes that are as punishment that is applied. This is self-explained, in other words, mufassar. But mufassar may be, explanation may be provided by another text. The words that we use, like salat and hajj, literally these mean something else, but the Prophet provided these words occur in the Quran. He said, take from me the rituals of the hajj, pray the way you see me praying. And he provided the explanation to the text of the Quran which mentions zakat and salat. We wouldn't know otherwise exactly how these things are done. But when he provided that, this became mufassar and self-explained. Acting on a text that is clear in respect of meaning, it is obligatory. And of course, should there be a conflict between an explained text and the one which is ambiguous, naturally this one would prevail over the other. There may be other examples that perhaps one can read in my chapter. Final degree of clarity is muhkam, that is perspicuous. It is a text that is in no need of interpretation. For example, in Surah 24, verse 4, وَلَا تَقْبِلُوا لَهُمْ شَهَادَةً أَبَدًا. Do not ever accept their testimony. This is with reference to a person who accuse others of slanderous accusation. Abada, the word never again. This makes it perspicuous. It's absolutely not open to the opposite of that. Al-jihad madwin ila yawm al-qiyamah. Jihad remains valid till the day of judgment. Certain things we take for granted. They are perspicuous. Although we, like God knows all things, it's a matter of belief. And there is no way we can interpret it, but we take it on face value. Then we move to unclear words. And this is also in 4 categories, beginning with obscure or khafi. The word has a basic meaning, but it requires clarification, and the clarification is provided through research and ijtihad. For example, in the text, the words occur of sariq, a thief, or qatil, a killer. Then these are, they have a meaning, but does the first one include, for example, one who steals shroud from the dead body, or one who pickpockets? Some of the elements of theft are not fulfilled here. Similarly, a killer, does it mean erroneous killing, erroneously, or only intentional killing? These are in the nature of obscure, and the scholar in mujtahid provides the explanation through research in ijtihad. The second one, in even more ambiguous, is mushkil, or difficult. This is inherently a word that is inherently ambiguous. The first one had a meaning, but here we also, in order to find the meaning of a difficult word, we again resort to ijtihad. And some words that have more than one meaning, like qur'a in the Quran, this is a homonym. Qur'a in verse Surah 2, verse 2 to 8, can mean either a menstrual period or the clean period between menstruations. It is in Arabic language can give both of these meanings. The Shafi'is have adopted the clean period between menstruation. The Hanafis apply the meaning it means menstrual cycle itself. If you then apply one or the other, the actual calculation of the time lag would differ. Then the whole text may be difficult to understand. Like we have in the Quran, in Surah 4, verse 79, whatever calamity that affects you, whatever good that you experience, it is from Allah. But whatever evil you experience, it is your own conduct, through your own conduct. Then in another place, قُلْ إِنَّ الْأَمْرَ كُلُّهُ لِلَّهِ, that the affairs of all of it is in God's hands. Now when you put the two together, which is the correct meaning? We don't understand, we don't quite understand. But through research and ijtihad, maybe there are ways of understanding, but it's difficult. Well, the third category is mujmal or ambivalent. This word is also inherently unclear, and the meaning is provided here not by the mujtahid and scholar, but by the lawgiver himself, in which case usually a meaning other than its original meaning is given. We have earlier mentioned the salat and zakat. Zakat literally means purification, but the lawgiver has given it a meaning which is quite a different meaning. Then we have a hadith, La salata illa bi fatihatil kitab. There is no salat, no prayer without reading the Fatiha. Now what does this la mean, no prayer? Does it mean that it is null and void, or that it is incomplete? There are these ambiguous words in the Quran, and when the lawgiver himself, the Prophet or the Quran itself, provides the interpretation, then that becomes clear. There is a room for research and ijtihad. And finally, on the rack of ambiguity, the most difficult that occurs in the Quran is the mutashabih, or the intricate. It's complete mystery. No one knows the meaning of the mutashabih in the Quran. For example, there are about 19 surahs, chapters in the Quran begin with these abbreviated letters, Alif, Lam, Mim, Yasin, and so on. No one knows the meaning of this. Some have speculated that these are the names of these chapters. Others said that only the Prophet knew. Others have put a different meaning to it, but they remain completely unclear to us. And sometimes, so in several places, Allah refers to His own word, hand, or to His own eyes. In another place says, Laisa kamislihi shay. There is nothing like unto Him. Now where do we stand? Is it to be understood literally, or no meaning to be put? We don't know at all. Now from another classification of words, this time from the viewpoint of the scope of their application. Words are divided into general and specific. It is quite an important category, the am and the khas, and it is rather a conceptual classification that is not always clear by looking at the linguistic and grammatical forms of words. Sometimes the grammatical forms, the scholars have specified that these are the signs of a general word, these are the signs of specific, but it is not totally understood through looking at grammar. The definition of a general or am is, it is a word applies to many, but not limited in number, and it includes everything to which it can possibly apply. If you read in the Quran, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, that man is in a state of loss with regard to time. We lose all the time. Now, insan here absolutely includes everyone without any exception. It is general. There is basically, the general word has one single meaning, but it applies to all that it applies, possibly apply. All men. Men has one meaning. It is in that respect different with a homonym that has more than one meaning. As I said, that the scholars have established this position that normally all words that occur in the text of the Quran and Sunnah convey their general meaning unless there is reason for us to specify it in some way. And it is in respect of the scope of its application that the general is different from specific. Specific is either a particular individual or a specific application of word. If you say that this house belongs to Ahmad, Ahmad is a specific person and this is not a general word. A general word may be general in its form, like houses, students, all. This is general by the way it looks. Or it may be general in its meaning, people, community. This is the meaning of it is general. Or it may be general by the prefix that is linguistically attached, like every soul, living soul, will touch the taste of death. Kullu nafsin, the kull, every, that makes it general. In the Quran, other words, jami, all, kafa, all of these are also signs of general words. When a command in the Quran occurs in the form of a general, then it must apply in that as general to all its possible application. But when its application is specified of a command, whether of the Quran or any command, then would naturally apply in that order. The specific as opposed to general, the general is open to interpretation. The specific is not open to interpretation, but occasionally, perhaps in rare situation, even the specific may be given an interpretation, like the kafara, the expiation of breaking a fast during Ramadan, or breaking one's oath, solemn oath, is to feed 10 poor persons. Now, it's very clear, 10 poor persons. But sometimes these Hanafis say, yes, one person, if fed 10 times, would do it also. Sometimes difficult to find 10 poor persons also. Sometimes it is the customary usage of people, of society, that determines the application, whether it is general or specific. Or sometimes it's the context. If I say, for example, I honor people, actually my intention is people in this particular community, not so the context actually gives it, specifies the general meaning, and sometimes it is custom that does so. The general is also in 3 varieties. That aam mutlaq, one which is absolutely general. If you read in the Quran, kullu nafsin, every living being will taste death. Now, there are many, of course, examples. When we have a specification of some kind, then that general is specified. In the earlier example, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي, man is in a state of loss. And then followed, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا, except those who have faith and do good works in their lives, they gain something. So the general in the first is specified by the subsequent clause. Sometimes the word is general, but actually it conveys a more specific meaning. In chapter 3, verse 97, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حَجُّ الْبَيْتِ. God demands people to go to the pilgrimage of Hajj, but then only those who are capable financially. So here the text is actually less than absolutely general. For example, the verse of inheritance in the Quran would apply to all relatives that are mentioned as they are. But when you have in a hadith this declaration, La yarisul qatil, the killer does not inherit. Without the existence of this specification, the general would apply as it is. But when the hadith came, then the general terms of the verse of inheritance became specific in this respect. Sometimes the specification is also supplied by ijma, by general consensus. In Surah Al-Jum'ah, there is that when the azan in Friday congregation, when the azan is given, rush to the remembrance of Allah. But consensus has determined that it does not apply to women. There is nothing in the text there, but here specification of the general is supplied by general consensus. There are some more details of Arabic nature that I will not discuss them, but merely to say that the specific is definitive, is decisive in its application. And this is there is a difference of opinion. Not on this. All ulama, all scholars are in agreement on this. The khas is qat'i. But whether the general is decisive or speculative, the Hanafis maintain that the general also is definitive, whereas the majority maintain that the general is speculative. If there is an interpretation, for example, a general in the Quran is interpreted by, or there is a ahad hadith that qualifies the general terms of the Quran. The general, if you follow the Hanafi, that the general is decisive, then should there be a conflict between a general and specific, there is a conflict between two equals. But if you take the majority view that the general is speculative and there is a conflict between general and specific, the specific will naturally prevail. And ahad hadith can specify the general of the Quran, but the Hanafis say no, because ahad hadith is speculative and the general of the Quran is decisive. One is weak, one is strong, and does not qualify the other. And there are, for example, I'll give one. In the Quran you read, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adl wal ihsan. God commands justice in the doing of good to people. Now, this is general. Adl is justice, is general. But then when you look, for example, at students' examination scripts, you are not going in the business of administering justice there. You look for, you have to discriminate in favor of some. And if you are taken to task, why do you do? Now the question is that in some areas, the general of the Quran may be specified according to context. So if you maintain the Hanafi position, justice must be applied even in that situation. But if you take the Jumhur position, then you qualify it and then that. There are some more details between the majority in the Hanafis with regard to the scope of specification and takhsis, and whether the actual meaning, whether it is in the nature of, if you make an exception to a general text, or when you qualify it in some way, is it a mere explanation, or sometimes doing this can actually mean suppressing one text and give it priority or another. But those are the details that one can read. And from the scope, from the viewpoint again of the scope of their application, words are divided into two types. One is absolute, the other is qualified. Absolute word is neither qualified nor limited in respect of application. For example, when you say a bird or a book, this is absolute. But when you say a white bird or a green book, then you have qualified. Some scholars have gone on record to say that this category actually there is no difference between am and mutlaq, the general and the absolute, and they are very much alike. So we need not to draw this classification. But both mutlaq and am is open to interpretation. The qualified is different from a specific or khas. The muqayyad is different from khas in the sense that the specific applies to one particular instance or individual, whereas the qualified may apply to an unlimited number of people. If you say a white bird, you have qualified, but the number is open. But specific is specific in its terms of application. To give an example in the Quran, when absolute word or text is qualified in some way, then that qualification, if it is provided by another text, that prevails over the absolute. We read in the Quran, prohibited to you is blood in dead carcass for consumption, in Surah 5 verse 3. Now blood is am and absolute, but we read elsewhere in the Quran, daman masfuhan, that is shed blood shed forth. Therefore it doesn't include liver, for example, which is clotted blood. So that qualifies the absolute, and in which case suppresses the meaning of the absolute in the qualified prevails. Then we move to another discussion that is majazi and haqiqi, the literal and the metaphorical, the original meaning of words in a transferred meaning of words. Words are normally used in their literal and primary sense, but sometimes we depart from that in favor of a secondary meaning for some reason. For example, you call a lion, you call a brave man a lion. Calling a brave man a lion, it is a metaphorical, it's a secondary meaning. The first meaning of a lion is, of course, an animal. But there is some kind of a linkage, because that animal is strong and courageous, so that is why we apply this in the metaphorical sense. But both literal and metaphorical meaning cannot be applied to the same word at the same time, although words can retain their original meaning and applied in a secondary sense, in a transferred sense. Normally, when you read a text of the Quran or Sunnah, it is the literal meaning that you must uphold, and you do not recourse to you do not shift to metaphorical meaning unless there is some evidence for us to do that. For example, if someone says that I make a bequest of my assets to all the memorizers of the Quran. Now, memorizers of the Quran literally has a meaning. Supposing someone had memorized the Quran and then forgot it, that would not be a part of that bequest. Memorizers mean memorizers retain the text. If someone says that I make a bequest in favor of my children, the children means one's immediate offspring. Grandchildren are normally not included. That will be a transferred meaning. The literal, the original meaning of children is that. Both literal and metaphorical occur in the Quran. When you say, La taqtulu, do not kill, it has a literal original meaning. But then when you read that He sends sustenance from the sky in Surah 40 verse 13, وَيُنَزِّلُ لَكُم مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ رِزْقًا. By sustenance from the sky, it's not the original meaning of food, but what it means that He sends rains. So this is the transferred meaning. But you have to read the transferred meaning. It's necessary to do that. When you sometimes read the text, Allahu nurus samawat, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, in Surah 24 verse 35. Now the literal meaning of light is one thing, but that is not meant here. Sometimes the metaphorical secondary meaning dominates and suppresses the original haqiqi meaning, like the word talaq. Talaq or divorce literally means removal of restriction. But this meaning, which is the original meaning, is completely suppressed by the secondary meaning of talaq, which is something else. Now literal is in three varieties: lughawi, urfi, shar'i, linguistic, customary, and juridical. When you say horse or man, this is the linguistic meaning of that is known. The customary meaning of words, sometimes the custom gives it another meaning instead of the original. وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ. There is no living being on the face of the earth that God does not provide for. Now, dabba means every living soul. But the Arabs understand it here, dabba, as a four-legged animal. And only that customary usage has given it that meaning. Juridical, haqiqi, sharia gives a meaning. Like zakat, the literal means purification, but sharia gives it a different meaning. That is the sharia haqiqi. Now the majazi or metaphorical is also divided into three types, but I will not discuss them. Finally, both haqiqi and majazi is divided into two other types. They are either explicit, sarih, or implicit, kinaya, elusive. The explicit or sarih is one which conveys the intention of the speaker clearly. And when haqiqi combines with sarih, explicit with literal, then it becomes the highest degree of clarity. Like Fatima married Ahmad. It's absolutely clear. It is explicit and it is haqiqi, literal. But when it alludes elusive, implicit or kinaya, it does not deliver the intention of the speaker clearly. In the Quran, an example in chapter 4, verse 43, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, when you touch women, your ablution is broken when you touch women. What does touching means? It has two meanings. One is the literal meaning is touching, and the other is, of course, sexual intercourse. Which does it mean? Now, according to the Shafi'is, it means both. So, if you touch the hand of a woman and instead of you are in wudu, your wudu is broken. The Hanafi say no, it only means the metaphorical meaning, not the literal meaning. That is sexual intercourse. When you have that, then your wudu is broken, but not merely by touching the hand of a woman. So it is important that one understands these different shades and meanings and classification of words in order to be able to understand the meaning of a command or a provision in the text. Finally, there is another variety of interpretation. This is called mafhum al-mukhalafa, divergent interpretation or contrary interpretation, as opposed to what is delivered in the explicit text. Is this a variety, acceptable variety of interpretation? For example, there is a text, many, in a hadith, when water reaches the height of 2 feet, إِذَا بَلَغَ الْمَاءُ قُلَّتَيْنِ, or roughly 2 feet, then it does not carry dirt. When water reaches that depth, it does not carry dirt. You can perform wudu in ablution by. So, the contrary meaning would be, although the text does not say, that if it is below that level, then it does carry dirt. You read in the Quran again, in the text of the Quran in Surah 4, verse 59, وَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. If you dispute over a matter, refer it to God and to the Messenger. Then the contrary interpretation would be that if you do not dispute over a matter, then you don't have to refer it to God and to the Messenger. You can make a decision. This is the contrary interpretation, mafhum al-mukhalafa. Now, the jumhur, that is the majority of ulama, accept this as a variety of interpretation. But there is disagreement. The Hanafis say, yes, we can accept it, but we do not apply it to the revealed text, to the text of the Quran and Sunnah. We need to be careful. Do not draw contrary conclusion from a text that says something. We cannot be sure that the contrary meaning is intended also by the lawgiver. But the Jumhur, who do accept this as a variety of interpretation, they say it's okay so long as 3 conditions are fulfilled. The first is that the contrary interpretation does not exceed the scope of the expressed words. That is, for example, in the Quran say there is a text, do not utter a word of uff, the slightest word of contempt to your parents. Now, if you draw contrary interpretation, say that you can do other things to your parents, and maybe physically you can lash them or abuse them. Of course, this would exceed the scope of those words. You cannot draw this conclusion. If you are not allowed to say an oath, are you then allowed to say other things? That will be unacceptable. The second condition is that the custom of people, the usage of people, the meaning we give it by divergent interpretation does not go against the general understanding of how people understand it. And third, that the clear, the expressed meaning is not left out for fear of some kind. For example, if someone say that I give this 100,000 charity to Muslims, but then the person say, I actually had meant both Muslims and non-Muslims, but I did not say non-Muslims in case, Muslim would have disliked that. So it is not left out for fear of some kind of, if there is a favor or fear, then that kind of interpretation, divergent interpretation, should not be attempted. But if these three conditions are fulfilled, the majority say it is an acceptable variety of interpretation. The Hanafis apply to other instances of application except the text of the Quran and Sunnah. And for reason of distortion, we must avoid distortion. We try to be careful. So with this, I conclude my discussion of the rules of interpretation. The subject has been rather technical, but it is of crucial importance in reading the sources of Sharia, the Quran and Sunnah. You need to put them both together. There is this general belief, and the ulama have gone on record to say that you should not read Quran in isolation from the Sunnah of the Prophet, and you should not read the Quran, some verses in isolation from the other. And you should also be careful to give the words the kind of interpretation that complies with these rules and limitations. That is the essence of accurate application. In ijtihad, that is the effort that a scholar makes in order to extract the ruling of a new issue from the text. As I said at the beginning, must have a firm grasp of these shades of meaning in order to be able to carry out proper research and ijtihad into the sources of Sharia. Thank you.